global footprint, right? Where are they and how? So for instance, if you're a company and you manufacture products in a country where child labor, forced labor, labor abuses, human rights abuses are known, then yes, I think you are aware, and companies have tended to take steps and be more aware and focused on that. But if you're not faced with it evidently, then I think it's the challenge of how do you ferret it out throughout your organization, throughout your company and your supply chain. But I think the awareness, I think it is building, Sarah, just as, 10 to 15 years ago, the whole board diversity wasn't as kind of inculcated and accepted, understood by the business community. Climate risk, financial risk, it's all moving in that direction. And I think, to Heather's point before, really it's helping to move the conversation and move the awareness out of, and it's CSR, corporate social responsibility. It's a very important function in the company. So not denigrating it, but it's got to move it into the C-suite so that the CEO understands it, the COO operationally, what does it mean? And how can they be part of the solution, right? In procurement, how can they be part of the solution? Legal compliance, of course, as well. So, and then fundamentally, it's a board issue because boards of directors are, particularly over the last number of years, have become far more aware of their role and importance of their role in helping to guide companies in making sure, in support of their fiduciary obligation, that the companies are understanding the full panoply of risk and opportunities, as well as being part of being a good corporate citizen, right? And being part of a solution. So I think I'm encouraged because I see the conversation, awareness, priority shifting to the C-suite and the board level, which is really where it needs to be.
Thank you. Heather, did you want to comment on that?
Sure. And it's really, Tara's done a lot of work in this space, and it's thanks to her good work that the awareness is really being elevated to the board level, coming alongside companies, helping them think through what this means for them. And I'll just simply note from my angle, while I appreciate the early adopters, we do have some laggards. So we have some more work to do. And I think consumers appreciate seeing their favorite company's commitment to environmental sustainability and equity. That's really important, those value statements that so many are making right now. I used to work in the outdoor industry, and I applaud their efforts to hold vendors accountable for climate and DIA practices with new product standards. And I think it's great. But how great would it be if they added a slavery-free supply chain value to that list, right? I know myself, I would pay more for my gear if I knew for sure that it was free of forced labor. And so I think we as consumers can also stress what our values are and ask them not just to think about the environmental sustainability piece and equity, which is really important, but also ensuring that the supply chain is slavery free.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I 100% agree, Heather, and that the power of the voice, right? The power of the consumer is becoming even more, I think, evident to companies, and using that opportunity. I absolutely endorse that. I also just want to say, also for the war for talent, I mean, employees and writ large, and lots of younger generations, including these wonderful law students coming out of Catholic, are demanding companies who are good, responsible corporate citizens. And I think that's also an opportunity, Heather, for us to help contribute in the awareness so that, yes, climate is front and center, as well it should be, absolutely. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, yes. And this needs to kind of be put into that priority of conversation for talent, for consumers, for boards, for everything.
Great, thank you. Well, you've both talked about both their companies that are really realizing what the problems are and trying to deal with them, and you've worked with companies to do that. Can you give us any examples of, in both generally or specifically, of the kinds of steps companies are taking and what kinds of measures they're putting in place? Heather, maybe would you respond to that first?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely, Sarah. So there's been some important reporting around the fishing industry, forced labor, fishermen who are not able to get off of the boats, especially during this COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that's really illuminated some areas where big brand retailers and food companies have come to the table and said, okay, we clearly have an issue. What can we do? And have partnered up with some NGOs and pilot projects. And I really appreciate them being the early adopters and saying, we don't know how we're going to do this just yet, but like from a value standpoint, we must do something. And so I'm really encouraged to see some of these public-private partnerships between governments, the NGOs, and major corporations really ensuring that not just that the fish from the sea is fresh and not just that we're taking care of the environment, but we're also thinking about the fisherman who's on the boat who may be exploited. So I'm encouraged to see some of that happening also in the fashion industry. We have seen folks take a lead, especially some of the companies that are working on fast fashion. They've come out with some lines where they're ensuring their products are free of forced labor. I'm really encouraged by that. I think to Tara's point earlier, this next generation of young people, and even I myself, I'm willing to pay more for a pair of jeans, even if it's $15 more, if I can ensure that it's free of forced labor. And the other thing I'll say too is one of the questions that I get from companies often is, has anyone ever done this before, Heather? Could you just give me proof of concept? Sometimes they just want to know that this work is doable. And so I try to give them that boost of confidence and say, it is scalable, right? And let us help you get there. And so, if you could give them not just that assurance, but also encourage them that they can be leaders in this space. And I'm telling you, after the first goes, everybody else, all of their peers come to the table and say, wow, look at it, look at that leadership there that they're displaying from a value standpoint. How can we emulate that? So that's a glimmer of hope that I have even more so on the horizon in respect to this.
Great, thanks. Tara, did you want to add to that?
Just briefly, Heather has great examples there. What we're talking about is really how you build this into the culture of a company, and what that means, ESG, but human rights, how you are building that so that it is part of the conversation at every table, at every meeting, right? Wherever companies are thinking about an initiative, thinking about a partnership, thinking about their operations, have we considered the human rights issues or impacts that our operations in this country may be having? Have we fully done our job to diligence it? And I hear the same thing as Heather said, right? Which is companies, because it is such a huge issue, and it can be a challenge to think through kind of what are the steps that we can do as a company to affect that kind of change. That is a challenge, but as we talk with more and more of the companies, their boards, their management, you see more and more companies building ESG and human rights into every kind of every element of the company, not just stovepiped into, oh, this is over here in human rights, ESG, or compliance. It's got to be threaded throughout the fabric of the company.
Thank you. I want to just touch on a little bit about the law and judicial decisions and ask, I mean, we all know that transnational regulation is difficult at best for a variety of reasons, but what about the domestic laws? And we have a few questions in the Q&A on this. So for example, in the US and in much of the rest of the world, there are occupational safety and health laws, and there the US Trafficking Victims Prevention Act, Trafficking Violence Prevention Act, the UK's Modern Slavery Act, I guess, which was preceded by California's Transparency and Supply Chains Act. There are the conflict minerals provisions of Dodd-Frank, there are Australia's Anti-Slavery Act, the EU's Anti-Trafficking Directive, and now perhaps on the horizon, a new EU directive. So are these helping? Are these laws making a difference? One of our audience members has added another one, the recently announced SEC initiatives on ESG disclosure. those kinds of things. Are they making a difference? And we might add, are they making a difference in the courts as well as to the public? So Heather, what do you think about that with respect to these new domestic, maybe I shouldn't say new, but more and more frequent domestic regulations and directives?
Yeah, I'll let Tara answer from the international perspective, because she's really brings the technical expertise. But from the domestic angle, some of the efforts that I executed with my former colleagues to address forced labor were not only anchored in human rights. As the US government, we try to make value statements. Our country's core values are built around the pillars of liberty, justice, and freedom for human beings. I referenced earlier that I spent over 50% of my time in the White House focused specifically on forced labor. And that effort was extremely collaborative, and it necessitated the cooperation of every agency. And it necessitated support from the Hill as well. So I think, when we look back, policymakers sometimes, I'll throw myself under the bus, right? We can be far too removed from communities. And I'm really grateful that I cut my teeth with a non-government organization doing important work in communities. And when I was writing policy and giving comment on legislation, I was vividly remembering my meetings with workers who were being exploited in garment factories overseas. And I just myself have never lost sight of the fact that people are created with inherent worth and dignity and should not be commodified. And I think that's something that needs to come out in our policy making. So, we have the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It was an important step. It was the beginning of the anti-trafficking work in the United States. And there's a tremendous document out from the State Department that really outlines the milestones that you could read for yourself. But for me, I think we paused and reflected and said, okay, we need to celebrate 20 years of good work, but what else is on the horizon? Where do we go to next? And we're not slowing down. I think, that we can always get smarter and faster and better. So laws are important things for us to hang our hat on. It's something that is action forcing. It necessitates offices such as my previous role. We have an ambassador at large who sits within the TIP office because of some of the legislation that was written. And so I think there are some unseen positive things and steps in the right direction that do come out of policymaking. And Tara, I'll maybe turn it to you for some of the international work, but I'm pretty pleased with the work that's been done so far. And we've had some partner countries replicate some of that and contextualize it for their own regions of the world.
Great, thank you. Just to keep in mind, we do want to leave a little time for audience questions. So, but it really is important to talk some more about this. But Tara, maybe as you answer this question, you might comment on the courts and what's been happening.
Yeah, so the only thing I was going to add, Heather did such a great kind of quick summary of what's been happening here domestically. We've talked a little bit about international EU. The courts here, I think, too, are becoming more incisive, aware of the importance of compliance writ large, risk writ large. So if you look at, for instance, the vast majority of US companies are incorporated in Delaware, and starting in 2019, there were a line of cases that really interpreted the Caremark standard of what's expected of a board in terms of their oversight of risk and compliance programs. And I was encouraged by that because it showed the courts really saying, wait a minute, boards, were you doing your job and meeting your fiduciary obligation and making sure that the company was fully understanding the risks that were facing them and were addressing those risks? And to the point that we were talking about earlier, moving this into the mainstream of the C-suite and boards as a risk area, I think will also help keep moving that progress forward. I'm hopeful, at least.
Great, thank you. I think you both touched on the need for consumer awareness and perhaps investor awareness as well. Do you have any comments on what people of goodwill can do to help, either as consumers or employees or investors? Is it a matter of awareness? Is it a matter of making demands on companies, working together? Heather talked about buying a pair of jeans for $15 more if you could get, or whatever amount more, if you could get a slavery-free certification. Is that realistic? And is that what we need to start doing? Any comments on how we can work together? Heather, you want to go first?
Sure. I can't stress this enough that your purchasing power as an American consumer is absolutely something that can move and should move the needle. Let your favorite companies know that you want to purchase goods free of forced labor and leverage that almighty American dollar to demonstrate what you're willing to spend. We've seen other movements that I think speak to this. In particular, farm to table, the organic movement, even locavores. I know a lot of people who are trying to reduce their carbon footprint and support local businesses by keeping their purchases within 100 miles. And I think that's all great. I think we just need to add one more question, which is this product picked by forced labor? And there's been some really good work by the NGO sector to demonstrate that it really doesn't cost that much more, maybe a penny more per pound to produce strawberries or other things free of forced labor. So I think asking those additional questions and really aligning your voices, maybe collectively, and saying, this is something that matters to me and I'm willing to pay a little bit more. I know myself, like I'm willing to pay $7 for a cup of coffee if the beans are made by direct trade, because that's something that's important to me. So I can't stress it enough that you know, make your voice heard and let the companies know what's important to you.
Just to follow up on your remarks there, we have an audience question that asks, is there any way to certify slavery-free products at the moment, or is that something we're going to have to work on?
It's something we have to work on. We haven't gotten there yet. We have fair trade certification. Certainly that's helpful and a step in the right direction, but I think there's more room to grow.
Okay, great. Thank you. Tara, did you want to respond to that same question?
The only thing I was going to add to Heather's comments about, yes, the power of your purchasing power as a consumer. Absolutely. We talked earlier about talent as an employee. You have a voice and a strong voice to influence your company. I also just wanted to note about the institutional investor community, because I do think that's also an opportunity for us to help educate them and pull them along. You know, the institutional investor community has been hugely impactful in terms of moving diversity and inclusion forefront, right? Moving climate risk and climate change forefront. And I think that also is an opportunity for us, Heather, to get other, that's a large voice that can be brought to bear and that companies would listen to.
Thank you. All right, let's go to some of our audience questions. And I'm going to try to consolidate them so we have a chance to get through most of them. My colleague Mary Leary asks, history tells us that companies publicly state they support these initiatives, and I assume they believe this, but they then oppose new regulations and new laws that will force these and bad actors to do so. There also are a few other questions that touch on similar issues about verification and should restrictions like the blood diamonds imports, I assume from Dodd-Frank, do we need more of this kind of thing? I think it's really focused on the idea of, we all understand about greenwashing. How do we protect against a kind of a greenwashing or whitewashing, whatever we want to call it, with respect to the idea of slavery-free supply chains? Any comments on that?
Well, let me just, and then Heather, please jump in. I mean, I think, and somebody mentioned, I think in one of the prior questions about the ESG task force at the SEC, that is, the SEC has been fundamentally focused on climate risk, but it is an ESG task force that that is wide ranging, that is going to be looking at disclosures that companies have made in their filings and whether or not they are matching, right, what they're doing, right? Like, what are you saying, public? How is it matching? And so we're doing a lot of talking to clients about, you know, on your website, in your sustainability report or your ESG report, whatever, you know, in your filings at the SEC, and how you are making sure that you're holding yourself accountable and making sure that you really are doing the hard work and backing up those disclosures to the point that the questioner raised about, they make statements. Are they living those statements, right? How are they backing them up? I think the focus, it is certainly a focus on climate risk right now, but I think that is an opportunity to broaden the conversation and the understanding for both companies and regulators.
Great, thank you. Heather, did you want to add to that?
I think Tara covered it perfectly.
Okay, great. We have another question about the impact of COVID, which we mentioned earlier. Any comments on whether the global pandemic has exacerbated problems, or as we move out of this, is there more of a focus on human rights issues in global supply chains because of the pandemic? Just any thoughts you have in answer to that question?
Sure, maybe I'll take that one first. So these are early days. We're still getting more information about the impact of the pandemic and vulnerable populations. The National Human Trafficking Hotline here in the United States has reported that they saw an uptick of over 40% increase in reports on human trafficking. Anecdotally, the reports that we're getting are just devastating. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we have financial institutions coming to the table. I was just talking to a group of fraud investigators the other day. During this shelter in place situation, oftentimes they are the ones who are able to connect to the customer when there's a fraudulent payment happening. And they are sometimes the only point of contact when law enforcement or service providers or others are not coming in contact with potential victims. And so I think what we continue to need to do is have force multipliers like that, who are reaching into spaces that are actually the eyes and ears of the community, so to speak, who can identify something is not right here. I see a red flag, make that referral, make that SARS report, over to suspicious activity report to law enforcement or to the hotline, and to be able to be reaching into spaces where we just can't get to at this point in time. So I can't stress enough that sometimes that is maybe our only opportunity to have an outreach to a potential victim of exploitation.
Great, thank you. Tara, did you want to add to that?
No, I think Heather covered it. I think, yeah, we haven't seen the full impact of the pandemic yet, and it's still persisting, but it is what we've seen so far is horrifying. Yeah.
And more sadness for the most vulnerable people. But one of the questions asks about the UN Global Compact, and that certainly has received a lot of publicity when we first came about. I haven't looked at the numbers lately, but at one point there was something like 11,000 companies signed on to this compact about their business practices. And they are filed as required, as I recall, to file an annual report. Could either or both of you comment on the impact of the Global Compact, and is it making a difference?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I it's hard to isolate one thing and say, well, that's making this impact, UN guiding principles, this, it's all of a fabric, piece of a fabric, right? I do think it's making an impact. I do think it's helping with the awareness and to have companies sign on and have to really back that up. Is it the answer? No, I mean, it is part of the solution. I think it has made a positive impact, and I think there's a lot more work yet to be done.
There are a couple questions about perhaps some of the industries that are the biggest human rights offenders. Also, a few specific questions about the chocolate industry and the fairly recent publicity about the voluntary protocols that just aren't working. And I guess do you have any comments on whether there are particular industries that we as consumers and people of goodwill should keep our eyes on? Or what would you suggest in kind of looking from a public perspective as to what we can do in looking at particular industries?
Maybe I'll take a stab at that one, and then Tara can include any remarks on her end. I will just say traffickers exploit everything: drugs, weapons, people. and in multiple industries and in sectors. It's really hard to pinpoint one in particular. I think that we see exploitation across the board. Sometimes it's through transnational organized crime syndicates. Other times there's smaller operations with one or two traffickers. So it's really hard to pinpoint any one particular area. I think instead, what we're trying to do is to really go upstream to the root causes and to follow them, from our perspective, to follow the money, to say, okay, it doesn't matter what industry that this is in, we can detect and identify fraudulent, malfeasant, anti-money laundering. I mean, sometimes we were talking about trafficking tonight, but from my perspective, there's multiple ways for us to go after this. And sometimes it does look like an anti-money laundering case and it doesn't get tagged as a human trafficking case. So I think really we just have to kind of spread our wings and evolve our practice and not think so narrow and industry perspective, but cross industry, right? To really go after the bad actors. Because I think, I've been on the survivor care side before, and it's a worthy work, but you can only do that for so long before you ask, like, how do we stop this from happening? And so I think for us to go to the prevention side, and really think creatively about how we can clean up our supply chain and how we can take preventative steps to prevent exploitation is where if it were me, that's where I would spend my energies. So certainly we are aware of abuses in certain industries, but I'm taking a slightly different perspective and thinking from my vantage point at the Knoble, like how do we actually get smarter and faster and more innovative, just like traffickers are, because they evolve their practice all the time, to think about this in a new paradigm.
Great, thank you. Tara, did you want to add to that?
No, I thought Heather said it beautifully. That's exactly it.
Just one last very specific question, because we're running out of time, unfortunately. There are many questions we really can't get to in the depth, and they're just terrific questions. But here's one that I hope is fairly straightforward. Someone asks about the involvement of unions around the world in any of this work. I don't know if you all can comment on that. Are unions big players in any of this?
I don't know. Heather, maybe you know the answer to that. I don't, unfortunately.
So not to the degree that we've seen historically with other areas. I think, something that I've encouraged is that laborers be paid a fair wage. So for me, this is right in line with the work that they're already doing. So I'm not aware of any one particular group that is taking the lead on that domestically, but certainly that's within their purview. I mean, that's something that they're championing for every day. So, that maybe is another stakeholder that we need to take a closer look at. Internationally, for sure. I think labor unions are very focused on this internationally, but again, they're they're smaller entities. They're not as big as some of the labor unions here in the United States.
Okay, great, thank you. I want to, in closing, we'll go just a couple minutes over, but I'd like to ask each of you if you would give us just a few brief closing remarks, but could you focus on this question? What's next? What will happen over the next 10 to 20 years? What do you expect? What trends are emerging? How can we be acting really in partnership with business, but in all different ways to stop this problem that is so terribly affecting so many innocent lives? Maybe Heather, do you want to go first? Or?
Sure. Yeah, we talked about the pandemic. We've talked about a really dark issue, but we've identified many areas for improvement, but I'm encouraged by students and leaders who are convening and jumping into the academic arena and digging into these topics in a very thoughtful and critical manner. I just know the students who are joining for this program under your leadership, Sarah, will lead on human rights and do it much better than I. And I hope you'll take the efforts on human rights to the next level. I know I'll be cheering you on, but that gives me great hope for the future. There was a time where there was a small group of us and corners at conferences and meetings and UN assemblies talking about human trafficking. And now we enjoy people who are really coming to the table and saying, I want an on-ramp to engagement. How can I lend my skills and my vocation to this work? So it's not just a handful of us who are working on this effort anymore, we've really matured and involved in this work to the point now where we have a program at Catholic Law focused on it. So again, we have so much more work to do on the horizon, but I'm excited about this next generation of lawyers and professionals who are jumping into the arena.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to mention that my colleague Mary Leary is on the Zoom tonight, and she is really leading efforts at our law school to focus on human rights in particular, to focus on human trafficking and modern day slavery in particular. So she is doing a lot of this work and leading our effort. And we're trying to kind of join in that with the whole issue of business accountability. So thank you for that. And I too am very grateful for the many students who are deeply interested in these issues. Thanks, Heather. Tara, how about any remarks you'd like to make as we close?
Well, similar to Heather, I'm encouraged, and I've said that, you know, when you see the movement and when you see the conversation becoming mainstream, right? That it's part of programs, it's part of legal law schools, it's part of the ethos of what global law firms are doing, right? We have a whole modern slavery initiative at Paul Hastings, which is one of the reasons why, you know, the Knoble is so important, right? That we're able to partner with them. And companies this is moving in front and center. We have to raise awareness to make sure that human trafficking and human rights is going to be a conversation at the table, just like today, climate change and diversity, equity, and inclusion is. I'm encouraged because I think that is going to come. And I think because of not only the public-private partnerships that we see here, we see government action, we see the EU directive coming out, you're seeing a real movement and a momentum, which gives me encouragement. And then you couple that with the younger generations, who this is just part of who they are, how they think, what they expect to see in where they're going to work and where they're going to live. So use the power of your voice and the power of your dollar when what you buy, and demand that the companies, the communities, and the organizations in which you work and your networks, that you're part of the solution, because it is going to the store and looking at that fair trade and asking the questions of your employers. What are we doing to make sure that human trafficking and human rights are really respected and invested in as a company? So I am encouraged. I think the next 10, 20 years will be even better.
Great. Thank you so much. And I know this is a problem we've got to deal with immediately because it affects human lives, but every step is a good step. Thank you, Heather and Tara. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom, your expertise, and all that you're doing. Thanks to everyone here who has joined us today for this terrific discussion. The next program in our series is going to explore what some of the faith-based community organizations are doing with respect to business and human rights. And then please don't forget that in October 2021, we are hoping that we are going to be in person in Washington, D.C. at CUA and talking about business accountability for human rights. And I hope that Tara and Heather and a number of others will be with us then. So please mark your calendars for those dates. As we go forward, if you have any input or if you have other ideas or suggestions or even questions we couldn't get to today, please email me at duggin@cua.edu. Meanwhile, please keep safe and well. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.